Time to pull up a chair. We've got another great story for you today. Some people think being family gives them a free pass to treat you like garbage. Today here, we learn that blood doesn't always run thicker than water, especially when greed is involved. Brother expected me to fund his wedding after years of no contact. I exposed his lies and now he's broke. I, 35F, haven't spoken to my brother Jake, 32M, in over 8 years. We had a massive falling out when our father died, and honestly, I thought I'd never hear from him again. But last month, out of nowhere, I get this call from him acting like we're best buddies. Let me give you some background first. Growing up, Jake was the golden child. Mom and Dad always favored him, no matter what he did. I could get straight A's and they'd barely acknowledge it, but if Jake managed to pass a single class, it was cause for celebration. When he dropped out of college to pursue his dreams of becoming a musician, they supported him financially for years. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs to put myself through school and never asked for a penny. When Dad got sick with cancer 5 years ago, guess who was there every single day at the hospital? Me. Jake was too busy with his band and his girlfriend to visit more than twice during Dad's entire illness. Dad lasted 8 months, and in those 8 months, Jake showed up maybe 10 times total. Always had some excuse about gigs or recording sessions. The day Dad died, Jake wasn't even there. He was at some music festival 3 states away. I had to call him to tell him his father had passed, and his first response wasn't grief or sadness. It was asking when the will would be read. That should have been my first clue about what was coming. The will reading was brutal. Dad had left everything to me. The house, his savings, his car, everything. Jake got nothing except Dad's old guitar, which frankly felt like a slap in the face to him. Jake went ballistic, screaming that it wasn't fair, that Dad had been manipulated by me, that I had poisoned Dad against him. The truth was much simpler. Dad saw who was there when it mattered, and who wasn't. Jake stormed out of the lawyer's office that day and I hadn't heard from him since. Until last month, the call started friendly enough. He was asking how I was doing, talking about how much he missed me, saying family was the most important thing. I was suspicious immediately because this was completely out of character for him. Jake had never been the sentimental type, and after years of silence, this sudden brotherly love felt fake. After about 10 minutes of small talk, he finally got to the point. He was getting married to his longtime girlfriend Sarah, and he wanted me to be part of the wedding. He went on and on about how it wouldn't be the same without his sister there, how he'd made mistakes in the past but wanted to make things right. I was actually touched for a moment. Despite everything, he was still my brother, and maybe people could change. Maybe he'd grown up and realized what was important. So I said I'd think about it. But then he kept calling. Every day for a week. And each call, the story got a little more elaborate. First, it was just wanting me there. Then it was hoping I could help with some of the costs because Sarah's family wasn't contributing much. Then it became a sob story about how they'd already put deposits down on venues they couldn't afford, how their dream wedding was falling apart. By the 3rd week, he was straight up asking me to pay for the entire wedding. We're talking about a $40,000 wedding here. Full church ceremony, reception at some fancy country club, open bar, the works. He justified it by saying that since I got Dad's inheritance, I could afford it, and it would be a way to honor Dad's memory by bringing the family back together. I told him absolutely not. I said I'd be happy to attend the wedding if he genuinely wanted me there, but I wasn't going to fund his party. That's when his true colors came out. He started yelling about how selfish I was, how I'd stolen his inheritance, how I owed him this after manipulating Dad against him. All the same accusations from 5 years ago. I hung up on him. But Jake wasn't done. He started calling other family members, telling them his version of the story. According to him, I was sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars that should have been split between us, and I was refusing to help him in his time of need. He painted himself as the victim who'd been wrongfully cut out of the will, and me as the greedy sister who was hoarding the family money. My aunt called me crying, begging me to help Jake because family helps family. My cousins started giving me the cold shoulder at family gatherings. Jake had managed to turn half the family against me with his lies and manipulation. What Jake didn't know was that I'd been keeping track of his lies. See, he'd been telling people that he was broke, that he couldn't afford his wedding, that he'd been struggling financially for years. But I'd been watching his social media, and his girlfriend Sarah's too. These people were not living like they were broke. Just in the past year, they'd taken trips to Hawaii, Mexico, and Europe. Sarah was constantly posting pictures of expensive dinners, designer bags, and jewelry. Jake had bought a brand new motorcycle and was always showing off new equipment for his band. This wasn't the lifestyle of people who couldn't afford a wedding. I started doing some digging. It turns out Jake had been telling different stories to different people. To our family, he was the struggling artist who needed help. To his friends and social media followers, he was successful and living it up. To potential wedding vendors, he and Sarah were financially secure with good credit. I also found out that Sarah's family wasn't refusing to contribute to the wedding because they couldn't afford it. They'd actually offered to pay for a reasonable wedding, but Jake and Sarah had turned it down because they wanted something much more extravagant. They figured they could guilt me into paying for their dream wedding instead of accepting the modest celebration Sarah's parents were willing to provide. The final straw came when Jake started telling people that Dad had promised him the inheritance before he died, and that I had somehow manipulated the will. This was complete nonsense. Dad had been very clear about his intentions, and the will had been written 2 years before he got sick, when Jake was still the golden child. I decided it was time to set the record straight. It's amazing how some people can twist the narrative to make themselves the victim when they're the ones who created the mess in the first place. Jake's entitlement is staggering. Disappearing during his father's illness, then expecting to be rewarded with inheritance money, and now demanding his sister fund his luxury wedding. The manipulation and lies to family members show his true character. Update 1. I called a family meeting. I invited everyone who Jake had been spreading his lies to: aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole extended family. I told them I had some things to clarify about the situation with Jake and the inheritance. Jake showed up, probably thinking this was going to be some kind of intervention where everyone would pressure me to give him money. He walked in with this smug look on his face, like he'd already won. I started by showing everyone the will. Not just telling them about it, but actually showing them the document. I explained when it was written, how it was witnessed, and why Dad had made the decisions he did. I had documentation of every hospital visit, every time I took Dad to chemo, every night I spent at his bedside. Jake's name appeared on maybe 3 visitor logs in 8 months. Then I pulled out my phone and started showing them Jake's social media. The expensive trips, the new motorcycle, the designer purchases. I showed them Sarah's Instagram too, with all her luxury shopping hauls and spa days. I asked the room, does this look like a couple who can't afford their own wedding? The room went dead silent. You could see people's faces changing as they realized they'd been lied to. But I wasn't done. I had screenshots of Jake's conversations with wedding vendors where he'd represented himself as financially stable. I had evidence of the offer Sarah's parents made to pay for a modest wedding, which Jake and Sarah had rejected because it wasn't fancy enough for them. Jake tried to interrupt, tried to explain, but I cut him off. You want to talk about family helping family? Where was family when Dad was dying? Where were you when I was sleeping in hospital chairs and holding his hand through chemo treatments? You were posting pictures from concerts and parties while your father was fighting for his life. Jake's face was red with anger and embarrassment. He started yelling about how I was making this all about me, how I'd always been Dad's favorite, how this was just proof of how selfish I was. That's when my aunt, the same one who'd been begging me to help Jake, stood up and told him to shut up. She said she was ashamed of him, that she'd raised her own children to understand that love and support weren't just words, they were actions. She said Jake's actions had spoken loud and clear, and now he was facing the consequences. One by one, family members started speaking up. They apologized to me for believing Jake's lies without getting my side of the story. They told Jake that they were disappointed in him, not just for lying, but for abandoning his father and then trying to profit from his death. Jake stormed out, but not before screaming that we were all against him and that he'd never forgive any of us. Sarah followed him, but not before shooting me a look of pure hatred. My uncle later told me that Jake had been asking different family members for money for months, always with some sob story about being broke. Now they all realized that none of it was true. The family meeting was brilliant. Sometimes the best way to deal with a manipulator is to expose their lies with facts and evidence. Jake's reaction, storming out and playing the victim again, just proved everyone's point about his character. It's telling that even after being caught in multiple lies, he still couldn't take responsibility for his actions. Update 2. The wedding was supposed to happen last weekend. It didn't. Apparently, after Jake stormed out of the family meeting, things went downhill fast for him and Sarah. Word spread through our extended family, and then to mutual friends and acquaintances. People started talking about how Jake had lied about his financial situation and tried to manipulate his grieving sister into paying for his wedding. Sarah's parents, who had originally offered to pay for a modest wedding, were so disgusted by Jake's behavior that they withdrew their offer entirely. They told Sarah that they wouldn't support a marriage to someone who would lie and manipulate his own family. The wedding vendors started demanding payment for their deposits. Jake and Sarah had been stringing them along, promising that the money was coming, but when it became clear that I wasn't going to pay and Sarah's parents had backed out, the vendors started canceling services. The venue canceled first, then the caterer, then the band. One by one, their dream wedding fell apart. Sarah blamed Jake for the whole mess. According to my cousin who heard it from Sarah's sister, they had massive fights about his lies and manipulation. Sarah felt humiliated that her family and friends now knew that Jake had been lying about their financial situation and trying to scam money from his sister. The relationship couldn't survive the stress and the lies. Sarah broke up with Jake 2 weeks before the wedding date and moved back in with her parents. Jake, meanwhile, was scrambling to save face. He started posting on social media about how he'd dodged a bullet and was better off without fake people in his life. But his friends weren't buying it. Too many people knew the truth about what had really happened. His band, which he'd always claimed was on the verge of making it big, kicked him out. Turns out they were tired of his drama and his tendency to overspend the band's money on personal things. They'd been looking for an excuse to get rid of him for months. Without Sarah's income and without the band, Jake was actually broke for the first time in years. He'd been living above his means, counting on other people's money to maintain his lifestyle, and when that dried up, reality hit hard. He had to sell his motorcycle to make rent. He moved in with a friend because he couldn't afford his apartment anymore. All those expensive possessions he'd been showing off on social media started disappearing, one by one. My mom called me last week. She said Jake had been asking her for money, giving her the same sob stories he'd tried on everyone else. But word had gotten back to her about what really happened, and she told him no. She said she was ashamed of what he'd become and that she finally understood why Dad had written the will the way he did. Your father saw Jake's character, she told me. I was too blind to see it, but your father knew who Jake really was inside. Jake tried reaching out to me one more time, about a month ago. He left me a voicemail, not apologizing exactly, but trying to explain that he'd been desperate and had made mistakes. He asked if we could meet for coffee to work things out. I didn't call him back. Karma has a way of catching up with people, doesn't it? Jake spent years living a lie, counting on other people's money and goodwill to maintain his lifestyle. When the lies finally caught up with him, everything fell apart at once. The wedding, the relationship, the band, the lifestyle. It's poetic justice that he's now actually experiencing the financial struggles he'd been pretending to have for years. Update 3. It's been 6 months since Jake's wedding disaster, and I recently got an update on how he's been doing. Spoiler alert. Not well. My cousin ran into him at a grocery store where he's now working as a stock clerk. She said he looked rough, like he'd aged 5 years in 6 months. He was embarrassed to see her and tried to avoid conversation, but she managed to get a few details about his situation. He's living in a studio apartment in a not great part of town. The friend he'd been staying with got tired of him after a few months and kicked him out. He lost his car because he couldn't make the payments, so now he takes the bus to work. The band he'd been kicked out of, they actually did make it. They got a record deal and are touring now. Jake's replacement turned out to be much more talented and way less drama. They've specifically told people in interviews that they're glad they made the change when they did. Sarah, meanwhile, is engaged to someone else. A doctor she met through her job. My cousin showed me her Instagram. She looks genuinely happy, and her posts are way more modest than they used to be. No more designer bag hauls or expensive vacation shots. Just normal pictures of a woman in love with someone who treats her well. Jake apparently tried to reach out to Sarah when his life started falling apart, but she blocked him on everything. Her friends told people that she said dating Jake was like dating a teenager in a man's body. All promises and big dreams, but no responsibility or follow through. The most satisfying part of this update came from my mom. She told me that Jake had come to her a few weeks ago, asking for money again. But this time, instead of making up some story about being temporarily down on his luck, he actually broke down and admitted that he'd been lying about everything. He confessed that he'd never been as successful as he pretended, that he'd been living off credit cards and other people's money for years. He admitted that he'd been wrong about how he treated Dad and me, and that he understood now why the will was written the way it was. My mom said it was the first time she'd ever heard Jake take real responsibility for his actions instead of blaming everyone else for his problems. But here's the thing, I still didn't feel sorry for him. When my mom told me about Jake's confession, she asked if I thought maybe this was a sign that he'd learned his lesson, that maybe I should consider helping him get back on his feet. She said he seemed genuinely remorseful and that maybe family should give second chances. I told her no, not because I'm heartless or because I want him to suffer, but because Jake had spent 32 years learning that there would always be someone to bail him out when his bad decisions caught up with him. First it was our parents, then it was Sarah, then he tried to make it me. He'd never actually faced real consequences for his actions until now. If I helped him now, I'd just be enabling the same pattern. He'd learned that if he gets desperate enough and says the right words, someone will always rescue him. That's not helping him. That's just postponing the next crisis. My mom wasn't happy with my decision, but I think deep down she understood. She said she wasn't going to help him either, not because she didn't love him, but because sometimes love means letting someone face the consequences of their choices. Jake needs to learn how to be an adult, how to take responsibility for his life, and how to build something real instead of living off lies and other people's generosity. That's a lesson he can only learn by going through this himself. I'm doing great, by the way. I used part of Dad's inheritance to go back to school and get my master's degree. I got promoted at work and bought a house. I'm in a healthy relationship with someone who values honesty and treats me as an equal partner. Sometimes I think about that phone call from Jake 8 months ago, when he tried to guilt me into paying for his wedding. I'm so glad I trusted my instincts and said no. If I'd given in, I'd just be another person he'd learned to manipulate and use. Instead, he's finally learning what it means to stand on his own 2 feet. And maybe, someday, when he's really changed and not just desperate, we might be able to have a real relationship as adults. But until then, I'm perfectly fine keeping my distance. This final update really drives home the importance of letting people face the consequences of their actions. Jake spent his whole life being bailed out by others, never learning to be self-sufficient or honest. While it might seem harsh to refuse help when someone is genuinely struggling, sometimes that's exactly what they need to grow up and change. Op made the right choice by not enabling Jake's pattern of manipulation and dependency. Sometimes the hardest thing about family is knowing when to walk away. But setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's necessary. Thank you for joining us today. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video. Until next time, and please put your chair back where you found it.